And I want to take you to, in chapter 23, a place where there's an interesting expression. As I think most of you know, there's a Jewish understanding that, maybe I should back up a step and deal with something on my way through here. Frank brought up the issue of this big discussion over who is of Jacob, which is part of the way the world is going back and trying to revise and rehandle all kinds of information. You can satisfy anyone in the world who wants to go to the trouble. You can satisfy yourself that a great part of the Jewish people can measure their pedigree on back to the people of the Bible time. And of course, many of them are proselyted. But whenever Paul writes, what advantage is there in being a Jew much in every way? Chiefly, they have the oracles of God. In other words, the people that were handling the materials of Scripture at the time of Christ, you can find out for yourself if many of those folks who are Jewish folks today have a pedigree that can go back and connect. So that's a thing that can be ascertained. It's not that hard to find out. And I would just say, if you have a group of people who wake up one day and say, I am Israel, that would be one thing. Because of Israel, it's said that Israel will lose its identity. But if you have a group of people that, appear on the scene one day and say, we and our ancestors before us were the real South Kingdom people and the real Jewish people, then you can ask yourself if there's any evidence anywhere back there that they were handling the oracles of God. And I will just say, in cases like this one, you can satisfy yourself that there was not. And so that doesn't mean that there is no heritage in Jacob in blood. And there are many prophecies which are still remain to be fulfilled, which have an ethnic fulfillment. And people are scattered all over the world that look like every race under heaven who have a heritage in Jacob. And the reason is because of the scattering of Jacob's children and its involvement in every theater of the world. There are people that are born to Jacob literally as sons of Jacob all over the place. And so it's important to be able to discern between and make distinctions between that kind of analysis. And the reason it's important is if you're handling anything revelatory in Scripture and you want to understand what's going on in your generation, you have to be able to discern, those kind of things. How did the Jewish people come to be? Going back to what Frank was mentioning in reference to the two sticks, there's a distinction between the North Kingdom and the South Kingdom people in the two sticks. In chapter 37 of Ezekiel, it says, take one stick and write upon it for Judah and the children of Israel, his companions. And about the other stick, it says, take and write upon it for Ephraim and the house of Israel, his companions. And so we see that there are important things that are being resolved in our time. There are things which are critical. Part of the story of history, which is the story of God doing his work among men all the way until he has finished it and there's a new heaven and a new earth. But it's important that we have good doctrine and good understanding. And there's all kinds of things happening right now where people are throwing out things that can be easily verified in favor of fiction. Flat earth and all kinds of things are examples of problems that people are having managing information. So here in chapter 23 of Genesis, Bereshit, we find Abraham and Sarah. It says Sarah was 127 years old. It says literally, and it was the lives of Sarah 127 years these were the years of the lives of Sarah. Of course, from an English perspective, if you write in a translation, the lives of Sarah, you immediately encounter a problem. Everybody can only live one life, so you cause the reader all kinds of troubles. But we can understand that there are distinctions in a person's life and epochs, or periods of time that a person lives where their life functions one way, and then a period of time where their life functions differently. It's not an expression, it's not a grammatical expression that's unique to this situation. It's used elsewhere, but it's the idea that can be conveyed Hebraically is that within a lifespan there are lives, if you please. And so, how did Sarah have different lives? There was a time before she came into the land and a time after she came into the land. There was a time before Isaac and a time after Isaac. I've observed many times over the years that the women folks, whenever they're managing their relationships, they make distinctions between women who have become mothers and women who haven't become mothers. And it's a very valid and significant distinction, because a woman who has never been a mother has certain maturing experiences which have not occurred in her life and which she cannot connect with. Men make a distinction between men who have yet to have an occupation and take a career direction in life and have a full-time occupation, and men who don't. And to a large degree in male society, you are what you do. And to a large degree in female society, what you are has a lot to do with your family. And so these are real factors that exist in our world, and they're perfectly valid, such as they are. It doesn't mean that a lady who's never had children is not a valid person, but it does mean that motherhood changes people. And it doesn't mean that a man who has never settled down and been able to take a direction in life is not a valid person, but it certainly is a very different thing from a perspective of maturity if he is able to do that and has done it. So there's a time then whenever before Sarah is a mother, and a time after she's a mother, and she's a mother late in life. In fact, she doesn't live that long after she becomes a mother. She lives a long time beforehand, but not so very long afterward. And so Sarah was 127 when she died. What I set out to say a minute ago, as I think most of you know, there's a Jewish idea that the shock of hearing the story of what happened with the Akedah, the binding of Isaac and Abraham being prepared to take the life of their son, was what caused her to die. So that's an if. It's not here in the text. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm setting it out there as a thought. Consider that possibility with me as we look through what we have here. Vatamot Sarah, and Sarah died, B'Kiryat Arba, and Kiryat Arba, the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. But notice what it says in verse 3, Vayakom Abraham. So you have this word, kum, get up, all right? Vayakom, and he got up, all right? So he came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her, and then he got up, or he stood up from before his dead. All right? So there's a period of mourning. Now, what can we infer from this? Several things. He travels some distance. It's not immediately in his backyard, this burial, right? He travels some probably relatively small, but still not insignificant distance. There is a process that takes place with the gathering of the sons of Chet. They hear him. He speaks to them about buying the cave of Machpelah. Those are all things which require time. One of the things that we can infer from this is she wasn't buried the same day. Whenever we're dealing with a situation where people are being buried in a tomb, as in this case, the cave becomes effectively a tomb, it often happens that people are entombed sometime after they die, not necessarily the same day. However it may be, whether it was a period of time whenever she died, and then she was placed in the sepulcher, which is a cave in this case, sometime later, just as the bodies of Jacob and Joseph, for instance, were placed in there quite some time after their death. In the case of Joseph especially, quite some time after their death. It may be that that's what we're dealing with, okay? It may be that it was more prompt, but it may be that there was some passage of time. However long it was that Abraham mourned for Sarah, there was a time whenever he got up from his mourning. Now, we're dealing with Abraham in a time of transition. And all of us are in a time of transition. And there's a thing that's going on generationally. There's a thing that's going on with the children of Israel. There's a thing that God is doing at this time in history. It's a major time of transition. And one of the things that it's important to keep track of whenever you live in a time of transition, or when you're dealing with a major transition in your life, and it's this: don't get stuck in the point of transition. You have to be able to move out from that transition and move on to the other side of it. It doesn't have to be a moment. It can be a process, but there needs to be an end to the process, and then there needs to be a life on the other side of the process. As long as you go on breathing, you need to live, not just be stuck in some moment that you can never get out of. Okay? Think with me about the implication. If the situation is that Sarah hears of what happened with Isaac, and that the stress of that, combined perhaps with physical factors, whatever, causes her death. Think about what that's like for Abraham, potentially. Because people go through moments like that. Whether that's what happened in this situation or not, people have to deal with situations like that. And think about this with me. This is how that works. Abraham goes, he doesn't tell Sarah in that scenario what he's doing. And I seriously doubt that he did tell Sarah what he was doing, okay? And there's very good reason why he might not, right? So he goes, he binds Isaac. They both come back alive. Sarah hears about it, and she dies. Do you understand? That can turn into, God, you told me to do these things, and now my wife, my companion of all my life up until this moment, is gone. And in effect, you can have a case between yourself and the Lord in a scenario like that where you're saying, and it's really your fault, because you're the one who told me to do it. What do you do whenever you come to a moment where a major transition takes place in your life and you see that the difficulties that you are facing are directly a result of something that God told you to do or required of you? So lots of people get into a situation with God where they can't forgive Him. Mark Twain, one of the famous aspects of his life is that when his daughter died, he came to a place in his understanding of God where he could not believe and accept that God could allow a situation like that to develop. If He actually was a just God, and if He actually was a caring God, those kind of things would never happen. The grief of that experience, he was a very intense person. That's why he wrote very intense work, right? The grief of that experience was such that there is no evidence that he ever got past it. Part of what I'm saying is he got caught in the moment. Because even whenever he was old, he was still processing, years, decades later, he was still processing that disappointment. David had to deal with the disappointment whenever the situation happened in the moving of the ark, that the fellow reached out to steady the ark whenever the oxen were shaking it, and he died. David was disappointed, and he had a problem in his relationship with God from that moment, but a process took place, and on the other side of that process, he was able to be in a proper relationship with God again. In other words, he went through a process and it took months for it to take place, but on the other side of it, he was able to have a normal, functional, wholesome, healthy relationship, walking relationship with God. It's important whenever we're in a time of process a time of transition, that we actually are able to get through the transition, right? Abraham stood up. Vayakom Avraham. He got up from before his dead and spoke to the sons of Chet. Now, ultimately, it's after this that he goes to some trouble to seek a wife for Isaac. And then after that, he also takes a wife. So Abraham has this son by Hagar. He has a son by Sarah, Ishmael and Isaac. He has other children as well. And then he has these sons, and towards the end of the parsha it talks about it. He has these sons, Midian, and so forth, the sons by Keturah. Everybody whose name is in this passage, they form part of people groups that are important in Scripture. And it's interesting that the descendants of Ishmael have to deal with the descendants of Jacob, and the descendants of Jacob have to deal with the descendants of Ishmael. And it's interesting that the descendants of Jacob have to deal with the descendants of Abraham by Keturah. Midian is one of those children. You understand what I'm saying? It's interesting to even think about that in blessing Abraham and in blessing Abraham's children, and especially in blessing his named children, which I'm talking distinctly about those children of his which are named from those which were simply sent away in the east and never named, okay? The ones that were named, their people groups interact with the children of Jacob in ways that are part of the scriptural record. And for the most part, there's tension and difficulty. There's some harmony, but perhaps overall there's as much or more disharmony as harmony. Think about that. That in blessing Abraham and in blessing all of his children, Father Abraham had many sons, right? But some of the sons didn't get along with the children of other sons. Follow? And in the blessing of Abraham, they all get blessed big enough that they're able to cause one another troubles. And Abraham, who perhaps started out as a person over whom it was prophesied or for whom there was an understanding that he would never bear children, his name Avram, Big Daddy, would be a lot how that would come out in English. Okay? Big Father, right? Magnified or made great Father, right? Ends up with the name Abraham, father of many, but many of those that he's father of don't get along with the children of the promise. And why would that be? And the primary reason appears to be because they're the children of the promise. And I always appreciate how the Spirit works. But again, think about this with me for a minute. Why do they come under such pressure? Because they're the children of the promise. And everywhere anybody can be in resonance with some work of devils and something that's going on spiritually in the world. You've got a pack of devils that are running a program of some kind. Anywhere anybody can be in harmony with that, the enemy is going to crank it up and point it against the children of the promise. Does it mean that those people are worse than everybody else in the world? Not necessarily. People get in harmony with the work of a spirit of strife, they produce strife. People get in harmony with the spirit of lust, they produce the effects of lust. All right? People get in harmony with some spiritual process that the enemy is pointing against the children of the promise. Their strife and their rhetoric is going to move against the children of the promise. You yourselves, all of you here today, have taken a stand. You've done things in your life that have placed you inside the framework of your generation as people who agree with God about what He's doing in time and eternity. It should not surprise anyone here if the enemy gets up a pretty stringent, a pretty hostile program to run against you and make you pretty uncomfortable. It should not surprise anyone if the enemy knows how to take the things that are going on in the world with viruses and bacterias, and through a chain of people that he is in relationship with, bring them up against people that he's set his face against. Having set his face against God, it shouldn't be surprising that he's using the mechanism of physical disease and the processes of it to attack. It shouldn't surprise anyone if he sets up things in the media, if he does things where he's, again, this has already been mentioned, but if he's doing things that damage your reputation, if some falsehood or some slander is being brought up against you, that should not surprise you. Having taken a stand in a generation for righteousness, at a time of transition, you can expect more than ordinary conflict and more than ordinary hostility coming out of the spiritual realm that's moving against the work of God. That's why Yeshua said, "Blessed are you when men revile and persecute you," etc. That's why Peter said, we're going to get persecuted. He said, after you have suffered a while, may God establish and strengthen you. But he also said, let's suffer for the right reasons. Let's not be suffering for stupidity. Let's not be suffering because we're doing things that are wrong. But let's accept with grace and thanksgiving the suffering that is necessary and unavoidable because we're standing for what's right. Because in the same way, the spiritual warfare has raised generation over past generation, every generation past has had to deal with a raging spiritual war that's operating against those who are obedient. So if we're experiencing difficulty and we can't find any other reason why we would be experiencing difficulty, there is a sufficient reason merely that we have taken our stand with those who have allied themselves with God. There doesn't have to be another reason. Very often happens that people who join themselves to the work of Satan seem to kind of get a bye in this world. That shouldn't astonish us either. Part of the circumstances of the Parsha, Abraham is a nomad. He's moving about amongst his neighbors. Think with me for a moment about this before I go on to something that will amount to an application. He's moving about amongst his neighbors who are seated in their places. Okay, so you have these budding kind of city-states, major communities that have a king or a tribal ruler of some kind, typically a king ruling from them, and the villages that surround the city and the city itself and the land of that area, they're under the authority of that king. They have walls, they have gates, they have permanent dwellings. And economically, they're in a situation where if they're careful how they use the land, they can improve it, make it more useful year after year. If they're careful how they use the land, and the fact that they don't have to keep, if they have masonry, many of them have masonry structures, they don't have to keep pouring so much of their life into managing a dwelling which is temporary. If you make your dwelling out of wool and fibers, you're going to have to do quite a bit of work on it. Every time the wind comes up, you're liable to have something to do. It's kind of like if you use your fishing nets, then you have to repair your fishing nets. Okay? It's a basic function. If you have a house that's made of rocks and the roof is made of plastered mud, then you'll have to do something to it every so often. But it's fundamentally, economically advantageous to be stable. All of the land that's in the fields, Abraham does not have access to that land. All the pasture land around those cities where the people are running their flocks day by day in a course round about that city, Abraham does not have access to that. Where does he graze his flocks and herds? He grazes on the areas, on the no man's lands in between the cities. The places where it is not safe for the folks from this city-state to graze their flocks because the folks from this city-state and them don't always get along all right, that's the pathway of Abraham's life. Can you understand that? There is nothing simple that he chose or that God chose for him by making him a nomad in that land. It was all difficulty. Think about his security situation. Everybody else is gathered up behind walls. They can fort up in there and they can go out and wage war and they can retreat back behind their wall. You cannot carry a wall around with you when you're moving around in a tent. Your wall is people. And in Abraham's case, I think an important part of the reason it succeeded is because he also had some kind of an angelic overwatch. Now, I'm not getting that from text. I'm saying it's an implication. He spoke with angels. It's kind of inherent from that angels moved around with him. I'm also speaking from a scriptural perspective where it says in the psalm, God encamps his angels round about the righteous, and it says of Abraham that he was a tzaddik. So I'm saying there's a scriptural basis for the idea that he's got an angelic overwatch. And I just suggest to you that without that angelic overwatch, it probably would not have worked for him. I do think that explains sometimes why he's operating in a space of fearfulness, because it's not humanly rational to move around with a military force that's in the hundreds and expect yourself to be safe from military forces that were in the thousands to tens of thousands. And that's not a rational expectation. Okay? And so he comes into a place and he says, well, I don't think there's any fear of God here. That's a concern, right? I think that for the most part, I think that he lived in a place of faith and that he didn't deal all the time with fear. But there are times whenever he did. Then I want you to realize something with me about Abraham's life. Those moments are snapshots of his life. If the story was written of your life, and there were moments whenever your faith was not at its best, and those moments were written into the book, and that book was handed to people, wouldn't you find yourself motivated to say, when people are kind of standing in judgment over you, wouldn't you find yourself motivated to say, well, but most of the time I've been in pretty good shape, in this occasion and in this occasion, there was a process that I had to go through in order to get strengthened in my faith, but, give Abraham a little bit of grace as you're reading his story, folks, okay?